There is nothing worse than getting a pitch from someone or from a booking agent who clearly has not done their research on your show. Those are easy to say no to. But on the flip side, what about when you get a guest on your show who sounded great on paper, but they weren't so great on air? Well, in this episode, I have got my online business manager and our podcast guest concierge, Tayler Neeley, joining me to lift the curtain and show you our exact process for selecting guests for our podcast and how we teach our clients to do the same so that you can learn how to establish your own guest vetting criteria to pick the best guests for your show and kindly and confidently say no to those who aren't a fit. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Tayler, I am so excited that we are sitting down to do this episode because I feel like, first of all, this is a topic that we have not covered on the podcast before. And second of all, I feel it's a really important topic, especially for those of us who are either running a podcast on our own and or who are in the beginning stages of scaling our business. And having this vetting criteria in place for that slew of inbox pitches that you get on a weekly basis of people saying, hey, I'd love to be on your show. I'd love to be on your show can really help you hone in and figure out who's going to be the best guest for your listeners. So thanks for making the time to be here today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I first want to dig in by talking about some of the mistakes that we made. And I laugh because this was all me in the beginning, coming from like this solopreneur mindset. And as I began to grow my business and grow my team, suddenly it was like, and I remember you coming on board, you were like, Courtney, we need to have better systems in place for this. Like, I'm getting all these pitches. You're asking me to review them, but I don't know who to accept on your podcast as a guest. Like, who's going to be a good guest for you? And immediately it made me stop. It made me think about what made a guest a fit or not. And there were a lot of mistakes that we made, and there were a lot of problems that it caused. So let's just start there and break down, like, when you first came on board, thinking back, why was it such a mess?
Yeah, well, I would say probably first and foremost, we just weren't being picky enough with who we were bringing on the show. We weren't putting the listeners first in that way. I think that, first of all, you definitely want to say yes to as many people as you can. And so that can get difficult because there's a lot of good pitches that are coming through. And so when you have to be selective, it's like, okay, well, now what are my criteria? Because I want to bring everybody on that I can. But ultimately, that doesn't serve the listener. And so not getting picky enough and not having specific enough criteria in that way really was impacting your ability to connect with the listeners and give them the content that they were here to listen to.
Yeah. Well, and let's just read between the lines there and say it was Courtney's people pleaser that was not allowing us to be able to decline guests. It was so hard for me. It was so hard for me because these people would pitch themselves. And I can remember, especially in the early days of my podcast, I wanted to invite the biggest guests on that I could, like the people with the bigger audience than me, because I thought that bringing them on and then they would share the episode and then somehow that would magically grow my podcast. Spoiler alert, it didn't. And so I was inviting guests on for the wrong reason, first and foremost. Second of all, I couldn't tell people no. So that was a problem right then and there. And then third of all, too, which I think this will really lead us into what criteria we began to establish for this reason, was because prior to the rebrand of this podcast, the one that you are listening to right now, our podcast was a general business podcast. And if it was a topic that fit under the general business umbrella, we could potentially talk about it on the show, which did make it a lot harder to say, yes, this guest is a fit, or no, they're not. And our listeners were tuning in, but I don't know that they were truly engaged with the content because, one, we were inviting guests on any topic under the sun that related to business. It wasn't specific. It wasn't focused. But then also, those guests weren't getting an ROI from their episode. And then our listeners weren't really excited about the content because they never knew what they were going to get every week. It was like a variety show.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, which is why it's so important to get clear on who your audience is and who you're trying to serve, what their problems are, and how your podcast can solve those problems. That's one of our criteria.
Yeah, and for good reason, because think about it this way. Like, if you're listening to this podcast right now, the reason you're listening to this podcast is probably because I'm just going to get my little magic ball out here and make a wild guess that you either have a podcast that you want to grow that's not growing like you expected it to, or you want to launch a podcast that can convert listeners to clients for your business. Very simple, right? But if we did not have that focus, then this podcast would wind up being just like one of very many podcasts out there about podcasting. And even deeper than that, what you already know because you listen to this show is that we really approach things differently. We approach things here through the lens of human psychology. What actually makes something binge-worthy? What actually makes listeners want to tune in? What actually makes listeners want to come back every week for more? And what specific problems are we here to help our listeners solve? But admittedly, prior to this rebrand, I didn't have that clarity of focus. But now having that clarity definitely has made it easier to see which guests are a fit or aren't. But there's also a few other criteria that we put in place because now that, okay, let's say you're clear on your podcast, you have your defined niche, you know what type of guests you want to bring on who can fill a content gap for your listeners, there's still a few other things we need to look at. And Tayler, you were the one that really kind of brought this to my attention as well as we were developing this process. So can you take us through what some of those other criteria are that we look at as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say another one that's big and important is even though you have a lot of people in your space that are experts and you want to hear what everyone has to say, it's very important to make sure that your guest has an offer that doesn't compete with your own offer. It can complement your offer. And so you can have, someone in here who talks really about guesting. This is a good example. Podcast guesting would be a wonderful guest opportunity for someone for our podcast. Now, someone who has a program where they teach you how to launch and rank a top 100 podcast, that's just going to confuse the listener. And ultimately, that's not going to serve anybody.
Yes, so key. And also that made it very clear too, because I remember once we put that criteria in place, then we would get pitches and some of them looked like they could really serve our audience, right? Like they had that first piece dialed in, the first criteria of can they help my listeners solve a problem? Check, that box would be checked. But then when we would do some research and dig into what are their offers, what is their end game in coming on this show, and if the offer directly competed, then you're right, that does confuse listeners because ultimately those listeners are listening to your show and they're developing that relationship with you and they're learning to trust you as the expert to help them solve this specific problem. And so while you want to bring on people who can complement what you ultimately do, bringing on, like, just like you said, someone who competes with it will ultimately confuse them. And that's not a win for you. It's not a win for your guest and it's not a win for your listeners.
Absolutely. You nailed it.
All right. I know there's a couple of other criteria that we walk through, but I feel like when I create stuff in the business and then I turn it over and I'm like, hey, here's a process, like it literally leaves my brain. And I'm like, I don't know what the criteria are anymore. So, but I know there's a couple more. So take us through what else do we look at?
Definitely. So in the beginning, I think we probably wasted a lot of time giving more cadence to people who we shouldn't have, like we said. And these criteria definitely help, but it's not our job ultimately to pitch a topic for somebody to be on our show. And I think we did a lot of that in the beginning because we saw people with potential and we wanted them to have the opportunity. So we were like, well, this could fit. And I like this angle. So what if we did something like this? And ultimately what we noticed was a pattern. Our top caliber guests were not coming in asking for a pitch. They were actually providing a pitch that had an actionable and specific topic in it. And that sets them apart, day and night from people who weren't doing that. And those are the guests that you should be paying attention to.
It's so true. And I remember, again, this goes back to my inner people pleaser. It was like, well, this guest looks great, but like, I didn't love the topic they pitched. So let me go look through their podcast. Let me go look through all their stuff online, see like what else could potentially work for. And I was like, we shouldn't be the ones doing this work. Exactly what you said, right? That's the guest's responsibility. And this is true for you too, if you are guesting on other podcasts. And Kelly Moser's episodes talked about this. I'll link to those in the show notes, where the burden is on the guest to come up with the topic for the show. And the guest should have put in at least a little bit of time and a little bit of effort and a little bit of research to be able to see, okay, what topics have been discussed on the show prior? And where's the content gap that I could potentially fill? And then show me in your pitch how your topic can serve my listener and solve a problem for my listener. Because guess what? For me as the host, that shows me that you did your research. And what it shows me even more is that you care enough about my audience coming on to my show that I automatically begin to trust even more and lean into the fact that I believe you will serve my audience well because it's coming from a place that's not just ego. It's not just, hey, I wrote this amazing book and I think it's going to be great and I want to come talk about it, because my book is launching. Like there's a difference in that kind of a pitch versus a pitch that's like, hey, I took a look at the content that you were teaching on your podcast. I really loved this episode and what this person specifically said in this episode that really caught my eye. And it made me realize you haven't talked about this particular topic on your show before. And I think this particular topic could be a great conversation. And that topic needs to be specific and it needs to be something that hasn't been discussed from that angle before, because then it's even clearer where it's like, okay, this person actually cares. They took their time to show me that they care. And because they took their time, that means they must really want to be on the show. This is not just they're trying to get on as many shows as possible, but this is something that they care about. They really want to be here.
Absolutely. The ego pitch It's immediately clear when they come through the inbox. Let's just say that. And when you put these criteria into place, it's so easy to spot when it's not a mutual service situation, which is our last criteria. This is a perfect lead in because it needs to be mutually exclusive, that you're both there to serve and show up for each other's communities and provide value. Now, if someone's just there to sell a book, or they just want to, pitch their program, or they're worried and they won't answer your questions or give you good value because they're like, oh, people are just going to get everything they need out of this episode and then they're not going to go buy my program, or whatever, what have you. It's very obvious and immediately clear now with all of these criteria when people come through the inbox who are that versus, oh, I'm here to show up and actually have a collaborative community based episode.
And ultimately, that's what's going to serve your listeners best. It's so true. If there were any of all the criteria are important, but it's like if there was anyone that was the most important, I would say this one because it undergirds everything else. Yes, your listeners have problems that they want solved. You want a guest that can help do that and fill a content gap in a way that doesn't compete and in a way that ultimately comes from that place of service. And they will show you that simply by the fact that they have taken the time to do their research on your podcast and pitch a specific topic. I love it. So let's talk about then the big question on people's minds that I'm sure is like, okay, well, what about for the guests that come in now and it's not a fit? And it's clear that it's not a fit. What do I do? How do I tell them no? Because again, the people pleaser in me wants to like make sure everyone is like let down gently, and it's fine. It's like, it's not you, it's us. But how do we actually do that? There's a way that we've developed to do that too, which I think works really well.
I agree. It all started for us with having a template, a document that you can go to that has the bones of what you want to say, which is really important for us because then we can go in and when we have someone who doesn't necessarily meet our criteria, we don't have to worry about quote unquote saying no. We just go grab our template and then we plug in some things that make sense to plug in for that specific person. So really it's about gratitude, appreciation for the time and effort that it took to pitch them to us. And then just let them know, after reviewing your area of expertise, we've determined it's not an aligned fit. We're really grateful for you reaching out and we wish you all the best on your continued podcast tour. It's just as simple as that. Just a firm no, a firm but kind no goes a long way. And people really appreciate receiving the no either way. So don't just ghost people. It's a day and age where it's really easy to just hit delete in your inbox. It's really helpful feedback for people when they receive, a polite decline to your podcast invitation. So help them out in that way and just be appreciative and understand that it took effort. And as you all know, who also do podcast guesting, it takes effort and, time to put yourself out to somebody. And it can be nerve-wracking and it can be something that can be kind of a mental battle sometimes. But ultimately, having templates in place to be able to just kindly but politely say no when you need to is really helpful.
And I think what you said there too, you hit the nail about actually give them the no. They will be appreciative of it because we do live in a very fast-paced world and it is hard to put yourself out there. And I know coming from my standpoint of, pitching myself for dozens of things throughout the years, getting that no is sometimes it's closure. And it does your potential guest who's pitching themselves a greater service by saying no, because now you're not wasting their time. Now you've given them a no, they can move on and you can move on. And so I think that is really key. So what I am going to do is I'm going to put a link to our actual template that we use to decline guests. There's a few key points that we hit and it's all spelled out there on the template. And I'll put that in the show notes. You can literally go grab it, use it, and modify it, of course, however you need to. But this will give you the bones of what you need to be able to clearly and kindly say no. And one more thing I do want to touch on before we wrap up, Tayler, which I think is important too, because sometimes even with all these criteria in place, you still might not get a great guest on the show. And you might be like, okay, how, right? Because I did this, the guest did their research, I did my research. And for whatever reason, when it actually comes down to doing that interview, maybe they were nervous. Maybe they weren't as prepared as they should have been. Maybe you weren't as prepared as you should have been as the host to give them the best questions to get out the best answers. And so sometimes there are those times where it just is not a good interview. So what do you do then?
I mean, my number one answer here is just be prepared, protect yourself up front and from the beginning with a guest release. And having a guest release will just give you, the reserved right to edit or add anything or even not air the episode. And, sometimes that's going to happen. Sometimes two really amazing experts show up and the chemistry is not there, or for whatever reason, the interview just is not jiving, and you don't necessarily want to put that out to your audiences. And remember, that's our number one thing, is to protect our audiences. That's what you always have to keep in the back of your mind. It's not just, oh, it's okay, it's subpar, but it's okay, and I'm going to put it out because I have an episode due on Tuesday. Pivot if you can and reserve that right to just not have to air it if possible. And then just again, kind, clear, transparent communication with your guests is so important and goes so far when it comes to building community. So we always like to reach out and give a courtesy heads up. We're not going to be airing this episode so that people aren't constantly looking at our podcast and wondering where it's at or reaching out. We want to build rapport with everyone, regardless of whether or not that episode ends up airing. It's important they took the time to show up. So we want to make sure to, round that out beautifully in the end.
Yes. And it can be tough to do because, again, it's like, okay, the guest spent their time and you spent your time. And then it's like, well, it could just go out. But if ultimately you feel in your gut that it's not going to do your listeners the best service, even if you were to edit it to the nth degree and it's still, you just couldn't get out of it what really you ultimately wanted to give to your listeners, it is okay not to air that episode. Your guest release will protect you from that. That's why you have to have it. They will sign off on it in the beginning, of coming on. That should be part of your onboarding process for onboarding new guests. But there have been a handful of times where we have not aired guest episodes for a variety of reasons. One of those even being simply that they didn't show up with a good mic and therefore their sound was unairable. It was unlistenable and it was therefore unairable. And so sometimes that happens no matter how many bases you cover, no matter how great of links you go to try to make sure you're prepared, your guest is prepared, they have everything you need, you have everything you need. Sometimes it happens. So the best thing you can do is really just cover yourself in that case. And like you said, communicate with your guests. Because ultimately, they did spend their time to come on your show. Maybe you're like, okay, but how do I say that to my guest? Like, hey, I can't air your episode. Don't worry, we've got you covered. I will link to a second template in the show notes for you where you can see exactly what we do. Go grab it, go adapt it, go use it for your podcast. Not only will it save you time, it's going to save you the effort and also maybe the pressure of feeling like, okay, I got to come up with something to say in those rare instances where maybe I can't air an episode. But ultimately, we want to be able to air every episode. And so having this criteria in place will certainly put you light years ahead to be able to get the best guests on your show. And then preparing your guest and preparing yourself. I cannot overemphasize this enough. Even if your guest delivers a great pitch, you still have to do your homework. You still have to prepare your conversation. When you adequately vet your guest and prepare for their interview, the likelihood of you getting a bad interview, like something that you can't really air, is like 0.1%. It'll happen. You'll have that release in place. You'll have that backup in place. But the goal is for it not to happen. So you want that guest to give you their best content. So you got to know how to prepare. In fact, Kelly Moser also talked about this in her episodes on guesting, which again, we'll link to those in the show notes because it's really key to know how to best prepare your guests so you can get their best content. So I know that this is a topic that isn't often talked about, but Tayler, I appreciate you being here today to break it down and also just, to share transparently some of the mistakes that I made in the early days. And I'm so glad we have this in place now because I feel that it not only has it helped us a lot, it's helped the show. It's helped the show in a big way.
Oh, it absolutely has. It's been a blast talking to you, and I hope it's helpful.
And if you're listening right now and this was helpful for you, then I would love it if you would take just a second to go and tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify to let other listeners know that this show is worth their time. And make sure you go to the show notes to grab those templates that we have literally ripped out of our own Guest Concierge playbook and that we are handing to you to help you bring on the best guests for your show so you can ultimately serve your listeners well and build deeper trust, because that trust is the prerequisite for converting your listeners to leads. And speaking of trust, in the next episode, I'm going to show you another simple way that you can deepen the trust of your listeners through your episode frequency. We're going to talk about how often should you really be releasing episodes so that you can get your listeners in the habit of listening to your show and accelerate the relationship that they're building with you so that you can ultimately shorten the sales cycle of converting them from listeners to leads. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.